Tom.
Ready to go?
Ready to go.
Ready to go, okay. The English title of my talk is Children Still Weaving Budded Orioles, Ancestral Hands in the Book of Disquiet. I'll start with a few preliminary statements that will serve as the foundation of my talk. First, the English title of our panel is To Feel is to Create. Second, to feel in the Book of Disquiet means ultimately to feel the fear of death, what the Romanian writer Emil Cioran calls the most ancient of human fears. Third, the link that joins this feeling to creativity is found in the concept of catharsis, used by Aristotle in his Poetics to designate the process of obtaining relief from what we can call disquieting emotions. Fourth, there are essentially two ways of obtaining this relief, this catharsis. Either you give it to someone else, or you write about it. Fifth, the first of these techniques, what we call scapegoating, is described in the passage in a Disquiet anthology entitled Sentimental Education. There we learn that among the various methods for avoiding suffering, one of the most subtle and more difficult is to develop the habit of incarnating the pain in an ideal figure. We must create another I, charged with suffering everything we suffer. And the phrase occurs also, an inner sadism is required, a phrase that I'll return to later. Sixth and final point, the second technique, writing about it, is referred to in text 12 of the Book of Disquiet, in which Bernardo Suarez tells us, quote, "If I write what I feel, it's to reduce the fever of feeling. I make landscapes out of what I feel. I make holidays of my sensations. I can easily understand women who embroider out of sorrow or who crochet because life exists." Now, this is part one of my talk then, catharsis through scapegoating. With those remarks as my building blocks, I'll begin the talk itself by pointing out that incarnating the pain in an ideal figure, or scapegoating, perfectly describes Fernando Pessoa's strategy in fashioning the figure of Bernardo Suarez. In an often quoted letter, Pessoa explains of Suarez that his personality, I'm quoting, his personality, although not my own, doesn't differ from my own, but is a mere mutilation of it. As though to confirm the accuracy of Pessoa's explanation, Suarez compares himself, and I'm quoting, to a disease that's foreign to me, to which he adds that he's just the sick part of another person. In his introduction to the book, Richard Zenith documents the various ways in which Pessoa has mutilated Suarez. He calls Suarez a mutilated Pessoa with missing parts, points out that he lacks Pessoa's irony and sense of humor, and that he is condemned to working the fixed hours of a bookkeeper, while Pessoa, who wrote business letters in English and French, came and went as he wanted. To these we may add that Pessoa has condemned Suarez to writing prose rather than poetry. He's deprived him, in effect, of his own considerable poetic gifts, and that he has inflicted upon him a crippling, indeed an incapacitating form of self-consciousness. This is Suarez then. To wish someone a good day sometimes intimidates me. My voice gets caught, as if there were a strange audacity in saying these words out loud. It's a kind of squeamishness about existing. Pessoa's portrayal of Suarez's physical appearance in the preface to the book contributes as well to this fashioning of him as the ideal figure upon whom he displaces his own suffering. And this is the passage from the preface then. In his pale, uninteresting face, there was a look of suffering that didn't add any interest. And it was difficult to say just what kind of suffering this look suggested. It seemed to suggest various kinds, hardships, anxieties, and the suffering born of the indifference that comes from already having suffered a lot. Dejection, the stagnation of cold anguish, so consistently covered his face that it was hard to discern any other of his traits. His voice was hesitant and colorless, as in those who hope for nothing, because it's perfectly useless to hope. I'm reminded as I read this passage of Émile Cioran's assertion. It's in La Chute d'un Temps, in the essay on the most ancient of human fears, of Émile Cioran's assertion that, quote, cruelty is a sign of distinction, at least in a literary work. The more talented the writer, the more pleasure he takes in devising for his characters situations from which there is no escape. He pursues them, he bullies them, and imposes on them countless insurmountable obstacles, including ultimately death itself. Having fashioned Suarez as his scapegoat, Pessoa then resorts to the practice, which was devised ages ago by ancestral hands, of inflicting intense physical pain on him. In text 80, Suarez tells us, for example, courtesy of the inner sadism of his creator, that the skin of his soul is cut, that harsh things wound him, and that objects weigh heavy on him. He concludes by lamenting, "It's as if my life amounted to being thrashed by it." As though this were not cruelty enough, Pessoa takes the further step of inflicting upon Suarez the suffering of everyone else. Quote, "I suffered in me the aspiration of all errors, and every disquietude of every age walked with me to the whispering shore of the sea. What men wanted and didn't achieve, what they killed in order to achieve, and all that souls have secretly been, all this filled the feeling soul with which I walked to the seashore." As yet an additional stage of the scapegoating process, Pessoa devises ritual punishment for Suarez in the form of a prison. We see this most concretely in the interlocking enclosed spaces that consist of the office in which he works, the room in which he lives, and the narrow, confining street which is his neighborhood. He likewise imposes upon him the subjective experience of being confined to a boundless prison. Suarez tells us, "Life has given us no more than a prison cell." And then he elaborates, he says, "The bored live in a narrow cell. Those who abhor the narrowness of life live inside a large cell." And then he explains, "But those who suffer tedium feel imprisoned in the worthless freedom of an infinite cell." I just mentioned very briefly the ancient prototype fashioned by ancestral hands, as it were, of that boundless prison is indeed the labyrinth from classical Greek legend. It's the labyrinth in which, if I may say, the mutilated Minotaur has been incarcerated. I see that as the prototype that lies behind the infinite cell to which Bernardo Suarez has been confined. Imprisonment in the worthless freedom of an infinite cell is paralleled in the book by banishment. Suarez says, I suddenly find myself isolated, an exile where I always thought I was a citizen. And then, thank you, perhaps it's finally time to make this one effort, take a good look at my life. I see myself in the midst of a vast desert. The prototype, the archetype, as it were, for the expulsion to the vast desert, which coincides then with the imprisonment within the labyrinth, comes from Leviticus. It's the Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, in which the Azazel, the scapegoat, the guilt of the community is imposed upon, as a burden is imposed upon the scapegoat, who then is expelled into the desert. So I think I see those two prototypes then, of the Minotaur in the labyrinth and the Azazel from Leviticus 16 as, not that Pessoa was thinking of these things, I don't mean that, but that they do serve as archetypal prototypes then of that, of the kind of punishment that he undergoes. Okay, now I'm moving on, in good time as it turns out, really surprised it's been a good time, to part 2, which is catharsis through writing. Suarez says in text 65 that he would like to establish the same scapegoating link between feeling and creativity, to return to the title of our panel, as the one that had led to his own creation. He says, how I'd love to infect at least one soul with some kind of poison, worry, or disquiet. This would console me a little for my chronic failure to take action. My life's purpose would be to pervert, and his life's purpose then would be to obtain catharsis by scapegoating, by displacing it upon someone else. But then he says, but do my words ring in anyone else's soul? Does anyone hear them besides me? The answer to his question is presumably no. In other words, we never actually see Suarez displacing what he calls his fever of feeling upon another person. In text 299, he implies rather surprisingly that he does resort to this technique. He says, I've so externalized myself on the inside that I don't exist except externally. I'm the empty stage where various actors act out various plays. In his introduction to the Book of Disquiet, however, Richard Zenith rightly describes this declaration as strange. He then asks, are we supposed to believe that he, Suarez, who is one of the actors who played on the stage of Pessoa's life, had his own troupe of heteronyms? To which he replies, Suarez is clearly describing Pessoa's own method of survival. And I would add parenthetically that that method is precisely the one described in Sentimental Education, the sadomasochistic one of incarnating pain in an ideal figure. My own idea is that Pessoa's troupe of heteronyms disappears from the Book of Disquiet, but then returns in the words of the text itself, which replaced Bernardo Suarez as the ideal figure in whom the pain is incarnated. I'll preface my discussion of this point by quoting 3 passages in which Suarez talks about writing. Could you explain to me what this means, though? I have 14 minutes. I have 6 minutes. Okay, that's all I need. Thank you. Sorry, just what I want to make sure I don't take too much time. Okay, I get it. There are 6. When it gets up to 20, like that. In the first of these quotations that he talks about is the identification between himself and his words. This is text 193. He says, I am in large measure the self-same prose I write. I unroll myself in sentences and paragraphs. I punctuate myself. And then 2 passages referring to the cathartic power, the cathartic implications of writing. In text 4, he says, "And at this table in my absurd room, I, a pathetic and anonymous office clerk, write words as if they were the soul's salvation." And in text 221, "When the right words were said, all was done." We notice then, with respect to catharsis through writing, that Suarez explicitly projects or displaces himself upon objects, not, what I want to underline, he displaces himself upon objects, not upon persons. For example, he describes himself as an indissoluble residue at the bottom of a glass, as an object tossed into a corner, a rag that fell onto the road, as dead matter fallen in the rain and mourned by the howling wind, as one of those damp rags used for house cleaning that are taken to the window to dry but are forgotten, balled up on the sill where they slowly leave a stain. And my final example, he describes himself as ready to break, like things that shatter into fragments, shards, and debris, hauled away in a bin on somebody's shoulders to the eternal rubbish cart of every city council. As a second step in the process of achieving catharsis by writing, Suarez uses these mutilated objects to create, as it were, mutilated verbal patterns. I'll mention parenthetically that the entire book is, in the words of Bernardo Suarez's self-description in text 193, the ruins of buildings that were never more than ruins. Scattered throughout the book, however, we find passages that illustrate this structural principle, if we can call it that, by embedding ruined words within especially ruined syntax. This is a somewhat poetic way of saying that many of the most intense moments in our reading, in my reading at least, of the book of Disquiet, involve passages that are written in what we call, in what English teachers at least call, a protactic style. In other words, that words are put together without any subordination or coordination. To make sure that I have enough time for my conclusion, I'll give you just one example. There are a couple of examples that I have. One of my absolute most favorite of a passage, it's from text 31, of a passage in which you have just these bits and pieces of objects that come together in a very protactic text in which the fragments are joined together by ellipses. Did I say it's text 31? And it reads, I'll read part of it. To cease, to sleep, to cease, to be the ebb and flow of a vast sea. To cease, to end, so here you have death. To cease, to end at last, but surviving as something else. And here's the something else. The page of a book, a tuft of disheveled hair, the quiver of a creeping plant next to a half-opened window, the irrelevant footsteps in the gravel of the bend, the last smoke to rise from the village going to sleep, the wagoner's whip left on the early morning roadside, absurdity, confusion, oblivion, everything that isn't life. Okay, coming to my conclusion. Richard Zenith concludes his introduction to the Book of Disquiet with the lapidary observation that it is, I'm quoting, the world's strangest photograph made out of words, the only material capable of capturing the recesses of the soul it exposes. I would offer, as a possible companion to this remark, Suarez's own comparison of himself to an empty stage, but a stage on which, according to his own self-description in text 12, he unrolls himself in sentences and paragraphs rather than producing an actual play. Returning to the ancestral practices alluded to in the title of my talk, We may remember that Greek tragedies were performed in theaters that had two distinct spaces: the raised stage on which the tragic action unfolded, and a space beneath the stage in which the chorus performed. This spatial arrangement recalls my preliminary observation about the two ways of achieving catharsis, of relieving what Suarez calls the fever of feeling. On the stage itself, suffering is displaced upon the figure of the tragic hero, who will be subjected to a ritual form of punishment. Below the stage, suffering is transformed into singing and dancing by the chorus. The purpose of the choral songs, as Oliver Taplin reminds us in his Greek Tragedy in Action, was to move us into a different world, a different register, distinct from the specific events of the plot. The Book of Disquiet, moving to the conclusion then, the Book of Disquiet contains vestiges of ancient sacrifice. A scapegoat is designated in the person of Bernardo Suarez. Ancestral punishment is alluded to in the form of imprisonment and banishment. But the figure of the tragic hero and the enactment of his ritual punishment in the form of a tragic plot is consigned to the margins of the book. In place of the tragic hero, we find a one-man chorus named Bernardo Suarez, and in the place of the tragic plot, we have his mutilated lamentation. This may remind us of Suarez's desire to speak not only for himself, but for a countless multitude. He says, "And I wonder if my apparently negligible voice might not embody the essence of thousands of voices, the longing for self-expression of thousands of lives, the patience of millions of souls resigned, like my own, to their daily lot, their useless dreams and their hopeless hopes." And now to my final sentence. The nearest equivalent that we have in modern theater to the empty stage of the Book of Disquiet are the plays of Samuel Beckett. Both his radio plays, in which invisible voices unroll themselves in sentences and paragraphs, and in his late plays, one thinks especially of Not I, or That Time, in which mutilated texts are performed to the visual accompaniment of dismembered bodies. Obrigado.
Está a funcionar. Eu peço-vos desculpa, como sempre estamos atrasados. Tom, Cousineau, Roberto Vecchi e a Correia Duarte estão disponíveis para qualquer pergunta que queiram fazer lá fora. A próxima mesa que nós teremos, peço desculpa, Roberto, vou roubar, posso roubar? A próxima mesa que teremos será uma mesa dedicada à literatura e a maneira mais agradável de esquecer a vida, com Joana Matos Frias, Kenneth David Jackson e Patrício Ferrari. Lamento imenso, eles estão disponíveis lá fora. Acho que as três conferências foram excelentes. Em nome da Casa Fernando Pessoa, agradeço a vossa presença e agradeço sobretudo aos conferencistas.
Vou ali para...